Hello, this is the Politics and Letters podcast. I'm David Barfield with Jim Livingston, and today we're going to be speaking with Andrew Hartman, who teaches history at Illinois State University and is the author of Karl Marx in America. And Andrew, welcome.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Jim, for having me on.
Hey,
It's our pleasure. Um, when I first heard of the book, the and I it, the first thought that I had or thing that popped into my head was, Karl Marx on a horse, like in America, right? That's my image that I couldn't shake. But of course, that's not really all that this book is about. And I guess it's Marx and Marxism in America. Would that be fair to characterize it that way? What your book is about largely.
Yes. When Marx was a young man, he talked about emigrating to Texas, and I think a really cool novel would be like Karl Marx, Texas Ranger. So then Marx would be on a horse. But so somebody needs to write that. It won't be me. But yes, the book is more about so the first chapter is about how Marx conceptualized America, how Marx's thoughts about America, his conversations with people in the United States shaped his thinking on capitalism and politics. But the rest of the book is about how Americans read Marx, interpreted Marx, used Marx as a political weapon in various ways from the 19th century all the way up to the present.
Yeah, the second part of my question is, and so what, I mean, I guess maybe it's kind of obvious, but what was the impetus for you to get on the approach? Because typically don't, it's just us weirdos that like Marx, right? The Marxists, as we're
Yeah.
whatever, there's any number of definitions for that. Um, Both left and right trash us, and because I'll include myself and Jim as well. I'll just speak for him. We're all right. Um, so what got you going on this?
Well, I'm a weirdo Marxist as well. Um,
Good. Good.
and I had read a couple of these other really interesting reception histories, Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen's American Nietzsche, Martin Wassner's Heidegger in America, which is an incredibly weird but interesting book. And I was just really kind of taken with the idea of like tracking a famous canonical thinker through American history and what that might tell us. And when I first read these books, I thought, well, surely somebody's done Marx in America. And nobody really had, to my surprise. And because I've kind of been fond of reading Marx since I was a young person, I thought that that would be a good book project to tackle as my, third monograph after I had become a full professor. What do I have to lose type thing. And I thought at the time, well, maybe it'll be another 250, 300 page book like the other reception histories. I guess even me, a Marxist who understood US history pretty well and the history of the American left pretty well, I was surprised at how many people across US history uh, read Marx, thought about Marx, tried to put Marx into action, either as a force for good or as a force for evil. And so the book grew to 600 pages, and it would have been 1,000 pages if my editor had allowed for such insanity. Um, and so yeah, it just was one of those things like I love Marx and reading about Marx, and I thought I could do justice to the topic, and I thought it would be a really fun thing to do. And 10 years later, here we are with a big book.
cool. Can
Okay,
I follow up on that, David?
please.
All right. See me now. I think I was actually, believe it or not, in a rehab center. This was like, as you know, roughly 4 years ago, and the MD who was doing the take-in for all of us drunkards and thieves and so forth said, says here you're a Marxist. I said, where does it say that? And she said, well, somebody said that you're a Marxist historian here. It's in your record. And I said, oh, well, isn't everybody? And she started laughing, and and the reason I tell that story is not to remind myself of my sordid history, but um, my attitude is that Marx is this figure that is indispensable to the understanding of American history. And not just because he's a great theorist, but because American history seems to be the perfect laboratory for testing his ideas. Now, and that's certainly what I get from the first chapter. But Andrew, what do you make of that? I mean, you think that's right, or I mean, or is Marx this um, theorist who's only fit for, as David put us, put it, us weirdos?
No, I think you're right. And I think that's one of the main overall takeaways from my book that I hope readers get. So I was thinking, how could I write a book that would both interest Marxists, weirdo Marxists like us, but also people interested in U.S. history, generally speaking. And I thought that uh, by putting Marx and Marxist thought in conversation with U.S. history from the Civil War to the present, I would offer something new for Marx experts, Marx specialists, because it's not always a lens that Marxists are focused on. Because I do think, as you said, Marxist thought in conversation with U.S. history, the two work really well together, surprisingly well, surprisingly to many people, not to me or to you, it seems. But also, I thought that putting Marx and U.S. history in conversation with one another would offer a new lens, even for U.S. historians, even for people who are intimately familiar with the U.S., I guess, historical narrative and its many iterations. So that was, I think you're right. American capitalism and the way in which it's developed historically um, it's not that it has always proven Marx right or anything as reductive as that, but rather reductionist as that, but rather um, Marx's thoughts about capitalism, I think, um, are so central to how we understand historical development. And I think US history in particular has developed in ways that just continuously makes Marx relevant.
Well, here's a follow-up for you then. Okay, so there are recent biographies of Marx out that you have read and cite, Gareth Stedman Jones, for example. And Stedman Jones, to be specific about it, suggests that Marx ought to be relegated to the dustbin of 19th century history. I mean, that he was relevant for that moment, uh, but not now. So, can you elaborate on that and say, well, how, you just said something that he's even more relevant now than he has been. How so?
Yeah, so I think the two most read and cited recent biographies of Karl Marx is both Gareth Stedman Jones, Greatness and Illusions, I think is the subtitle, and Jonathan Sperber's, which is Karl Marx, A 19th Century Life. And both of them emphasize, as you say, that Marx's ideas should not be considered relevant now. Sperber says they're the ideas of somebody who was key in the 19th century politics of the French Revolution and thus should not be considered, I guess, a modern or contemporary thinker, even though I think Sperber was in that biography quite, like quite sympathetic to Marx. And even I would say on the left in a Marxist sense. But Stedman Jones, on the other hand, who's also kind of famous for being on the left, he's much more, I would argue, condescending towards Marx. He calls him Karl throughout the book, as a way to sort of like make him prosaic, which is fine, but also makes the case that Marx was wrong about most things and we shouldn't take him seriously as a contemporary thinker. Um, to me, that's the equivalent of the US historiographical move that has dominated the history of the left, and that is to sort of repeat over and over again Werner Sombert's question, why no socialism in America? I think they're the same thing. And I think it is both are rooted in a study of failure. Like the expectation is the left always fails in the US. The expectation is that Marx was wrong and Marx can't speak to anything about American history, society, or politics. And I guess I just firmly disagree. I feel like we're still living in a world that Marx imagined. We're still living, kind of swimming in the modern world that Marx wrote about, conceptualized, especially along a couple of fronts. One, that capitalism, um, its main propulsive quality is exploitation of the working class. And without the exploitation of the working class, you don't really have capitalism. And if that's not still true, I don't know what the fuck capitalism is. But also the more sort of poetic, but I think accurate rendering of modernity in the Communist Manifesto about all that is solid melts into air. To me, the sort of um, the way in which capitalism continually shifts and shapes our everything that we understand about the world, everything that we understand about culture and politics. Marx was right about that in ways that I don't even think he could have anticipated.
Damn right.
Yeah, well, you bring up in the beginning his reaction to the Civil War, which I thought was like if you were interested, if one was interested in what Marx is about, right, in a philosophy of history, justice, I mean, just any number of democracy, any number of things, the Civil War is kind of an obvious place. And his assessment of Lincoln, I was interested in the way you described that. And um, can you talk a little bit about his views of Lincoln as a mover? I mean, it's almost like or he's all, I mean, it's Lincoln in a sense is an almost acting, not as a Marxist, but as his behavior is is part of the orthodoxy, isn't it? In a way, or maybe even a lot.
Yes. That so, I'm trained as a 20th century US historian, so going back into the history of the Civil War was really fun for me. Um, and I think whatever you say about Marx's take on the Civil War, he was correct in a number of different ways. And I think you're correct also to say that this is really revealing for his, I guess, his project, his overall project, and where he stood in relation to all the things that we as 21st century human beings on the left think about justice. He was uh, very involved in the 1848 revolutions. Those failed, and that was quite depressing for Marx, both in the larger political sense, because the 1850s were an era of reaction in Europe, and he was quite depressed about those. But also personally, he had to live in exile in London. He lived in despair and poverty. Three of his young children died of tuberculosis or other diseases related to living in poverty in 19th century London. And then lots of his friends had sort of scattered across the earth, many of them ending up in the United States. He kept close correspondence with many of them. These are the 48ers, the famous 48ers. And so many of them, when they first landed in the United States, thought that it would be a temporary move before they returned back to the continent and picked back up their revolutionary activity. That, of course, did not happen, but they discovered quite quickly that they could continue their revolutionary project in the United States and that there was a lot of opportunity for that, especially as they moved westward and kind of got embroiled in the politics of the emergent Republican Party. And so lots of them, in fact, as the Civil War as the Civil War kicked off, voluntarily joined Union forces along the Western Front and were very active as abolitionists in trying to make the war transition, as Marx argued, the war from a constitutional one to restore the Union into a revolutionary one to abolish slavery. Marx was incredibly inspired by the Civil War, and it made him hopeful once again. And I would argue that the hope that the Civil War gave him allowed him to finish Capital. He finally had the sort of like inner energy to finish Capital, which is published in 1867. He was inspired by his 48er friends who were fighting to make the war about the abolition of
Oops.
the Protestants on the East Coast, who he thought were just like too proper to make this a war about revolution. He was also inspired by the enslaved themselves, who were flooding Union lines in what W.E.B. Du Bois later called a general strike, in terms of their sort of like movement for liberation. He was inspired by the English working class that aligned with the United States against the Confederacy, even though you could argue it was against their immediate interests because they were working in textile mills um, that were fed the cheap cotton from the southern slave-picked cotton. But he was also inspired by Lincoln, and that's kind of, to get around to your main question, that's a really interesting thing how inspired he was by Lincoln. Living and commenting on Europe in the 1850s, he was just sick and tired of these two-bit monarchs, two-bit aristocrats, two-bit authoritarians, who spoke in grandiose terms but did very little of historical significance. And here he had Lincoln, who he always was sort of like mocking as speaking in lawyerly terms. He's like, only in America would a man of the working class emerge and become a lawyer and then become president and issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which Marx considered one of the most important documents of the modern world, and do so in the tone of a lawyer. So Marx, in private correspondence with Engels and others, would be sort of mocking of Lincoln, but he thought that this was actually something really quite profound that he was speaking. This was the new sort of democratic majority that Lincoln was representing. And even though I think there were stark differences between Lincoln's republicanism and Marx's communism, especially on the question of land ownership, Marx saw Lincoln as on his side. And for Marx, the abolition of slavery was something that had to happen at a moral level, but also something that he believed would usher in um, more working class power because, as he famously said in Capital, where half of labor is branded in a black skin, it can't be free at all. I'm paraphrasing. And so the Civil War really bulked large in Marx's political imagination, as did Lincoln.
Well, speaking of that, speaking of his inspiration for or by American history or the United States, in its mid-century 19th century phase. He begins working for the New York Tribune in 1852, and he writes, I think, 900 or so articles for it over the course of the next 10 years or so. But you and I have had this conversation, or some parts of it before, but I would love to think that Marx's remark, yeah, it's first in the Grundrisse of the notebooks of 1857, 58, and then it appears in print in 1859 in his contribution to the critique of political economy, where he says the labor theory of value, the idea that labor is central to human nature, human being, and all modes of production, is a great theory, and it explains a lot, but it's actually true only, he says, in the most modern bourgeois society, the United States of America. And I always had the sense, I'm hoping you can either confirm or deny this, that it was his study of American history that allowed him to get beyond the romanticization of artisanal labor and begin to see wage labor as a possibly liberating moment in the development of human freedom. So I guess there's two questions there. One is, I think you've raised it already, at least implicitly. One is, okay, what did his study of American history, what impact did it have on him, if any? any measurable impact. And the other is was his conception of freedom, which you make a great deal of, I think rightly. To what extent was that drawn from the insights into slavery on the one hand, but also the new insights he could detect or draw from his study of the United States?
Yes, so you know, if you read Marx's thoughts on the United States from, say, the 1840s on through to the 1870s, he changed his mind quite a bit about certain things. Like, so for example, when he first was writing about the United States and on the Jewish question in the 1840s, it was based on his reading of several travel logs, including Tocqueville and others, mostly written by these conservative sort of defenders of aristocracy who were quite alarmed across the Atlantic Ocean. Marx was quite excited by developments across the Atlantic. He thought that universal suffrage, as limited as it was, but still quite expansive in the US at that time relative to in Europe, would usher in, if not socialism, then sort of working class consciousness and working class power, because why wouldn't the working class vote themselves into power, right? But then he was at other times quite cynical about the ways in which capital controlled the political system. Similarly, he did sort of believe, and I think correctly, that the US was a much more bourgeois society than Europe because it didn't have the remnants of feudalism or aristocracy. And it seemed to him that everywhere you went in the United States, and this is his study of the US, never his actual firsthand experience, but it seemed to him that everything was commodifiable, and so he talked about how capitalism worked as if in a greenhouse, or bourgeois society worked as if in a greenhouse in the United States. It was just that much more intense, that much more baked into the cake of the whole society. And whereas um, he could see the sort of downside to this, he was quite impressed by it as well because he believed that it would in the US was much closer to sort of achieving the class consciousness that Marx desired, that Marx thought necessary for movement beyond capitalism, because the aristocratic values, the fact that the aristocrats in Europe or the large landowners in Europe were the ones who first gained access to capital, had for him distorted the whole process of how he imagined capitalism transforming into socialism. So he was quite enthused by that. But on the other hand, he also recognized, sort of in anticipation of Frederick Jackson Turner, but through a glass darkly, that westward expansion was a problem in relation to the development of class consciousness because it gave Americans the illusion of being like independent artisanal landowners and laborers. And so this is really where the biggest distinction between Marx's views of history and the future relative to Lincoln, or the small R Republican views of history and the future in the United States. But Marx assumed, because he had witnessed such massive immigration to the United States during his lifetime from Europe, he assumed that the frontier, quote unquote, would be would come to a close quite soon, and then the U.S. would be confronted with a working class in cities across the country, similar to in Europe, but which with a much more sort of like bourgeois formed working class consciousness that he did believe would usher in freedom. So I think you're right, Jim. And I also would add that his close study of the United States during the Civil War and the ways in which people conceptualized freedom relative to labor also, I think, inspired him and many others that the sort of the key kernel to freedom was control over your labor, control over your time, control over your body, control over your mind, all the things denied to the enslaved, which he would argue on a spectrum were also somewhat denied to the working class or in an industrial capitalist economy. And until people had control over their labor, they wouldn't have control over their lives. And that's kind of like the key thing for him in terms of thinking about freedom. And I would argue it's one of the reasons why Marx has stayed alive in American political discourse, because there's not too many other avenues for thinking about freedom in relation to labor other than through a Marxist lens, I would argue.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Um, Jim, did you have something? Because I was
No, go ahead. Go ahead, David.
um, you wrote. I don't have the book. I have the your proof. So I hope that this makes it to the final edit, which is you write. In fact, the National Association of Canned Food Packers had long lobbied for federal inspection and labeling. And then you say, pickle tycoon H.J. Heinz. So I don't know. When I read that pickle tycoon, I just laughed out loud. I really hope that that does make it.
It's in there.
In there. Good. That makes it. But this one's really
I think those are my. No, I was just going to say quickly, those are my words, but I think I kind of got the idea from both Gabriel Kolkel and my late great advisor Leo Rebuffo. But those are my words. Yeah,
no, I love that. Heinz, what's his Carrie's wife and all that. I just
yeah,
brought up a lot of that stuff. But this question, I guess, is really directed at our sectarian friends. And when you talk about like the there, you also mention Marx's position on the 8-hour workday, right? That this was something he just was very firm on. And one could characterize these things as like, food labeling, 8-hour workday as sort of, the bad word incrementalism or just tiny little reformism, if uh, in the sort of Bernstein sense. And my position on this is, I like radical change too, but it seems like Marx had a sense of, of politics that was almost like kind of hard nosed and realistic. And I was wondering, was that what you were getting at with this? And that, the movement may towards socialism is going to take a lot of different forms or can, uh, and it's not just going to be, like we wake up tomorrow and we're in paradise, right? And that you're going to have to engage in this stuff. I guess, could you speak a little bit about the incrementalism versus, or reform versus revolution, I guess we could call it, or others have called
yeah, yeah.
it. It's an interesting part to me.
Wait for our Lenin to arrive at Finland Station.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that was my take. I've long thought about this way before I decided to write this book, long been thinking about the relationship between reform and revolution. I think Jim's writings have helped me a lot in the last 10 years kind of think about this question because I probably as a young person was much more on the I would never have called myself a sectarian leftist, but I was probably much more on the side like reform just helps the capitalists stay in power. Um, and revolution is the way, whatever that means. But I think with help from people like Jim, but also from reading Marx and his whole body of work, especially his writings late in life, I've come to the conclusion that Marx's views, and I think these are correct, are that reform and revolution are not sort of like mutually exclusive. They're not opposed to one another. His take on the working day was, and you can see this in Capital, but you can also see this in his support for shorter working day legislation in the US and in the UK. His take was if the working class can shorten their workday, in other words, if they can make it so that the capitalists have to pay them the same wages for for less hours of exploitation. That was a win in the class struggle. That was going to give the working class more power. It was going to make their lives better in the short term, but also sort of leverage their power in the long term. And so we can't think in this either or way. And that's kind of how I've taken all moves on the left throughout US history. We can't really say for certain, like with any confidence, that there's ever been a true sort of revolutionary moment in the US when it comes to working class power, I would argue, except for maybe the Civil War over the past 170 years. But there's been a lot of victories that have increased working class power for the better, both in the short term and the long term. And so I think that sort of either or sectarianism is defeatist, and I'm against it.
I just it's an idea that's been in my head and I've gotten skewered for it, but I'm going to stick with it anyway, is that in a certain way, Bernstein, for example, um, actually fits more in the Marxist or the orthodoxy and the teleology, because if we're assuming that socialism is something that can't, it has to have liberal characteristics, right? We have to have law, we have to have civility and good restaurants and all the stuff that goes along with like living well. Uh, you know, the Soviet Union doesn't really become a great example of that, um, of socialism, uh, politically, culturally, any number of ways. And I'm no critic of them. I just, you know, just observing. So, is that fair of me to say that? You think is can I characterize put Bernstein in that? Maybe not himself, but the idea of
Yeah, I think so.
my question is.
And even, well, so I don't know. I think you're correct and fair, but there's another way to look at it. So I was talking with Daniel Tutt, who has this other podcast, and he said that it seems like we're in a current, what he calls a neo-Kotskian moment. And what I took from that is um, a growing number of people on the left, and maybe he's being hopeful, but I hope this is true as well, are concluding that, especially in the current moment when things seem so bleak, to oppose reform and revolution is insane. So, like, uh, another really interesting take on this, which I think is moving in this Bernsteinian fashion, but maybe, I don't know, you all tell me what you think, but Bhaskar Sunkara's book, The Socialist Manifesto, I think makes a compelling case that we should the working class, both because it improves the lives of workers, but also because um, it gives the working class a platform for to push for more revolutionary change, and also it enhances the contradictions of class struggle because uh, the people in power, the capitalists, will oppose any sort of reform full-throatedly in a way that will um, in a way that will antagonize the working class. They're like, well, which all we want is universal health care, and you're fighting it tooth and nail. You really are the enemy. That's kind of the approach, I guess. So I don't know. We can sort of compare this to any number of 19th century European socialist movements, but I think that getting beyond to go back to the sort of earlier inclination, getting beyond the reform revolution binary, that paradigm is important for us.
Yeah, I'll say. I think David's remarks about Bernstein are really really crucial for thinking now about transitions, if you will, to transitions from capitalism to something else. I mean, do we hold on to some liberal inheritance and allow for the supremacy of society over the state, which is liberalism's central premise, and individualism as well, or do we not? And where does that steer us? But in those terms, then, if we may uh, attend to this question of periodization, um, you said earlier that capitalism can't exist without the exploitation of the working class, and whether we want to go into the intricacies of the labor theory of value is another question altogether. But okay, um, does that mean that we are in a transition to something else? Yanis Varoufakis, whom we interviewed last year on this podcast, calls it techno feudalism. He thinks that we're in a stage of development that is killing off capitalism. Um, and there are any number of other, variations on this theme. I guess Jody Dean has a new book in which he disputes that periodization. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about periodization. How does how does your study of Marx in America help us think through that? But then if you go to the other side of the question, you mentioned Turner a couple of times, Frederick Jackson Turner in the Frontier thesis. Um, at a conference once, I mentioned that Turner was working in the Marxist tradition, and the whole room just burst into laughter. It was like, "What? Hey, what are you talking about?" But I mean, if you read the footnotes in the famous Frontier essay, it's crawling with Achille Loria, who was the Italian Marxist and a famous one at that, that Gramsci also studied. So is it Marx in America? To me, if Turner is the founding father of the modern American historiographical tradition that insists that the regulative principle of analysis here is now going to be class rather than race, as it was in the predominant forms of 19th century historiography, isn't it fair to say then that the modern American historiography is a Marxoid one, at least? I mean, I think of Richard Hofstadter and the way that uh, people of the left, at least in the academy, used to dismiss consensus history, right? Oh well, he wasn't willing to talk about class, but Hofstadter himself comes out in the Progressive Historians and says, well, I mean, how could people not realize that this was a Marxist way of conceiving of American history? Anyway, that's a question that's too centrifugal here, but yeah, take up either end of
Yeah.
those questions.
Well, I'll take up the latter one first. Yeah, so in I do think that American historiography owes a great deal to a Marxist conception of historical development, even and sometimes especially in instances such as with mid-century liberal historiography, of which Hofstadter was maybe the most important, although kind of an outlier in some ways as well. Even in those instances, and sometimes especially in those instances, they owe a great deal to Marx. All of them were reading and writing about Marx in the middle of the 20th century, sometimes to disavow him, to sort of exercise the ghost of Marx, because so many of them had been much more favorable to Marx during the 1930s, when I guess being favorable to Marx was trendier than it was in the 1950s. But I think you're right that Hofstadter's consensus history, it's remembered as, oh, isn't this great? The US is so different from Europe because we're all liberals here. But Hofstadter was quite disappointed by that consensus. He was pretty cynical about it.
Yeah.
In fact, writing at a time in which um, things for many Americans had never been better, he was very cynical about the whole project. And I think that's an aspect of Hofstadter that we don't remember, and that to some degree is reminiscent of Marx, especially insofar as the liberal consensus was designed to sort of cover up class struggle. And I think that
Mm,
was secretly what Hofstadter still thought we needed some
mm,
of.
mm,
Um, so yes, like and I think even moving into the latter half of the 20th century, the historians stayed truer to the Marxist tradition than scholars all over the place, I would argue. And even when they were disavowing Marx, or even when Marx was much more of a subconscious shaper of how we understand historical development. The other question, shifting out of something else, I I don't know. I guess like if you look at US capitalism, there have been so many moments in which um, the people in power, whether we call them capitalists or not, were behaving in ways that we would consider not sort of necessarily like predictable from the standpoint of a rational bourgeoisie. And so I think oftentimes the idea that when the capitalists are behaving irrationally, we must not be in capitalism anymore. Um,
mm,
I just think there's rarely been a time in which the capitalists have been behaving rationally, and sometimes the the rationalizers to the system are people like FDR or the socialist movement, like progressive socialists, like people on the left are the ones who have rationalized the system. And I guess if the sort of the revolutionaries have an argument about reform, it's that the reformers have been the best rationalizers of the system because the capitalists always seem bent on destroying everything. Um, to me, it seems like we're in one of those sort of like keen moments in which the capitalists seem bent on destroying everything, including capitalism. But somehow I don't think that's the end of capitalism. And the working class at a global level is like the capitalism, the working class or the nature of the working class has shifted in the US and other richer countries that might lend itself toward this techno-feudalist argument. I don't know. I'm teaching a class this coming fall semester, a grad class, and we're going to be diving into some of this literature. So you'll have to have me back on after I give it a deep reading to think about it.
All right, good enough. David.
Yeah. We talk a little bit about you. I can't remember. I'm looking for the quote now, but it's I guess it's something that's always been around um, the this term populism, which
Mm.
has come up a lot lately. I guess with Trump and there's right wing populists all of a sudden, or maybe they've always been right wing. I tend to think that I mean, I don't know enough about the movement, the populist movement myself, but my sense of it was that was at least an ethic behind it that was a democratic. It wasn't socialism. Um, it didn't seem entirely democratic as in my understanding of it. But what usefulness is there in populism for a left project? Um, or am I just giving it short shrift and I'm not being nice to it? The basic.
Yeah. Well, the term has been abused in the 20th century. Um, so maybe it's not redeemable because now when we think of when in the sort of general imagination, when we think of populism, we think of Trump. Um, of course, all politicians try to be popular,
Right.
whether you're William Jennings Bryan or William McKinley, you want to appeal to a popular base. So the populist movement in the 19th century, late 19th century, to me takes off where small r republicanism fails, especially after the Republican Party, capital R, moves away from its Republican roots in its embrace of capital or in capital's embrace of it. And so populism was not anti-capitalist, it was not Marxist, it was not necessarily class-based in the way in which sort of modern Marxist left would think about what a left should be. But it was, I would argue, small d democratic in the sense that there were lots of, I guess, small farmers and people across the prairie, across the Midwest, across the South, who correctly thought that they were getting screwed over by corporations that controlled the means of production and were diminishing their livelihoods. Now, the right solution to that, I think a populist and a Marxist would disagree on the solution there. The populists, in this, I think I agree with the historian Charles Postal. The populists were kind of like smaller capitalists trying to argue that their small scale capitalism should still have some life, should still be able to sustain their lives up against the banks and the railroads of the East Coast. So it's kind of like a regional struggle in which the West and South loses to the big corporations of the East Coast. But I think it is small d democratic because these are people who just wanted more say over their lives. And I also agree with historians like Stephen Hahn in the sense that populism was a threat, especially to the large former slave owning landowners in the South. And we see the emergence of Jim Crow towards the end of the 19th century, in part, not totally, but in part, as a way to divide and conquer an interracial struggle that populism threatened to be, never really emerged as, and populism eventually moves in much more racist ways, but at least in its origins, sort of crossed the racial divide in the South in ways that threatened the oligarchy or the Southern Bourbons.
Can I follow up with that and just try to suggest that well, as we all know, the the most the per capita concentration of socialists in the early 20th century was in Oklahoma and Kansas, which had been the hotbed of populism in the 1890s. And so that transition is not impossible, but I think it is difficult. And the reason it's difficult is that whether it's left or right, populism uh, tends to believe in self-regulating markets, I think, in the sense that for uh, like neoliberals, populists tend to think that the market is a perfect mechanism so long as concentrations of power, typically legal chicanery or monopoly power, don't distort its allocative effects. And the principal allocative effect that a populist expects from uh, a market is equality. That is to say, if we are all equally subject to the anonymous laws of supply and demand, then equality follows. Okay. Um, that seems to me a misplaced assumption about markets that, their self-regulating capacity lasts for about 20 seconds and then it disappears. And monopolies are a natural extension of that, or a natural elaboration of the operation of markets. So, and the neoliberal version of populism, if you will, is the mirror image of that. That is, markets are self-regulating mechanisms that, if they are not distorted by state power, why, everything will be fine. Liberty will be enforced. They don't care about equality, but liberty will be enforced. So, so much for the liberal component of the transition from capitalism to socialism, I guess. All right, but here let's test these propositions that I think are at least implicit in David's questions. Your study of Marx in America suggests to me that there's really no predictable political valence here for Marxism, is there? I mean, like you mentioned Jonathan Sperber as you said something like the kind of left that a Marxism would produce. Um, do we have any indication from your book and from your experience in teaching history that there is a way of predicting what a Marxist will do politically or think politically or say? Or is it something that is by now, too embedded? So, that Marxism actually saturates our intellectual discourse, academic and not, to such an extent that it's like the air we breathe.
So what you're saying is Trump and the right wingers are correct when they blame Marxists for things like DEI.
I mean, in a certain, well, here, look at our little parochial part of academe, yours now. I'm retired, but I mean, who dominated the American historical profession, in the late 20th century, from the late 60s on, even onto today? Who were the giant figures in the writing of history? They were,
So yeah, so Jim, I guess it depends if you're a lumper or splitter, but let me think of, let me put it this way. Well, I think one thing my book does reveal is there are many different ways to interpret Marx in an American setting, and one of the reasons interesting to people around the world who have any interest in Marx is because the US is such a huge, diverse nation that there have been so many divergent and weird readings of Marx in a US
yeah,
context that I think are applicable to people around the world. So you've got what I would consider the sort of hardcore labor or socialist reading of Marx from the Gilded Age that is the focus on the labor theory of power. And then you have a more economic reading of Marx in the 1930s, which kind of viewed him as the prophet of capitalism's crises. And then you have the sort of humanistic Marx that emerges once the Young Marx is translated in the 1960s, that like young rebels really identified with, while at the same time you have the anti-imperialist Marx of primitive accumulation that was that allowed Marxists or allowed radicals in the 60s and at other times to be highly critical of American imperialism on Marxist grounds. But then you have even weirder mixings of Marx. So, I mean, Marxism, and you might not think it's weird, but to many people, the mixing of Marxism and pragmatism, quite strange. Yeah, I know. I know you don't think it's weird, like that's your whole thing, but lots of people have thought that's weird. The mixing of Marxism and Black nationalism has a long-standing thing that has a lot of purchase in the United States that's been kind of weird to people, or at least it takes Marxism in different directions. Marxism and feminism, Marxism and indigenous thought, the list goes on, Marxism and populism. So I think what my book does, I think, sort of, I guess, produce evidence to your point that there's no one particular political valence. But sometimes, and I agree with that, but I also sometimes I feel like there is a kernel there. So I call me a splitter, if you will, but there is a kernel there that we have to continue to return to if capitalism is the thing we want to overcome as Marxists. And that is that most of us are exploited and will never truly be free as long as we're living in a sort of political economy that exists due to our exploitation and alienation. I just think that's something we need to continue to come back to. We'll never be free, truly free in the way in which I think humans are meant to be free and flourish, unless that is the thing about Marx that we continually return to. And again, I don't want to be dogmatic about that. I'm not like I'm non-sectarian to the core, and I think that mixing Marxism with things like Black nationalism have led to some really interesting and provocative and productive ways of thinking about US politics. But this is the thing that I don't think we can stray from if Marxism is going to mean anything relevant to our political lives as human beings.
Well, that sounds like an inspiring way to end. But David, you can edit out me here, and we can go on if you like.
Well, we're closing in on the hour. They brought up my last thing in your, or sort of um in this last comment, but you mentioned Andrew, Mark Levin, and I mean, I have to say, I think that of all the scumbags that I've ever encountered, publicly, he's got to be he's like the poster child for all of this stuff. But you brought it up in this context of his criticisms of cultural Marxism, right? Or he's one of many people who go on about this. And as Jim, I think, suggested before, if I got you correctly on this, is that if you take Adorno and Horkheimer and the dialectic of enlightenment, right? When I was in college, like that was picked up by the postmodern left or the identity politics left, or however you want to term it, as a rejection of the Enlightenment, right? And that as far as a political project, equality, the battle cry of the French Revolution, all that stuff is just out the window, and we're not going to organize politically, if we're even going to organize politically, around those central ideas, which basically had dominated left politics for so long, right? And in a way, Levin, despite his idiocy, is right about this. I mean, in that was there. I mean, he's not taking up that exact position. Um, do we have to get back to what do we do with that rejection of liberalism um, in politics?
Yeah.
The Enlightenment. I'll just say it. I mean, I don't mind. I'll say it. The Enlightenment. Like what?
Yeah. Like we should be for the Enlightenment. I
And all that stuff. Like fuck it, right? No, we don't need.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we need to read Adorno and Horkheimer as anti-enlightenment, but rather as recognizing the dialectic, I guess, that things like the new freedoms produce new constraints. Um, so to me, it was a more pessimistic reading of historical development than, say, Marx himself, but to me, it was not nihilism in that sense. You know, the 20th century did not produce too much, at least in sort of Western countries, too much to be hopeful about if you're a Marxist, especially if you're a sectarian Marxist. And I would argue that like the Marxism did develop along some lines that we might have called cultural Marxism if that didn't become the right-wing buzzword, in the sense that going back to Lukács and the Frankfurt School and Gramsci even, there was a turn to culture, there was a turn to what I guess um, an orthodox Marxist would have called the superstructure very early in the 20th century to explain, for example, why the working class joined with their nations in the orgy of violence of the First World War rather than sort of class solidarity. The Frankfurt School was, for obvious reasons, very animated by the question of why so many German workers became Nazis. And then they come to the US and they're very animated by the fact that it seems like lots of American workers, white workers in particular, um, are McCarthy supporters. Like, so these are the questions that are animating their pessimism and their turn towards culture, ideology, and the like as an explanation for why people don't have the appropriate sort of revolutionary class consciousness. And so, even though Levin, as you say, is a complete idiot, and reading his book will just make anybody who does so dumber, it's the dumbest read dumbest book I've ever read, American Marxism, and I've read a lot of dumb books. You know, he talks of he rather than the Frankfurt School, he calls them the Franklin School of Berlin. And then a second edition of the book was issued, and I checked to see if he had revised that because obviously it had been pointed out to him a million times, and he did not. He does not care. He does not give a shit what we make of his book. But in any case, there's a kernel of truth there in the sort of like cultural Marxist right-wing conspiracy going back to the 1980s in terms of a turn to culture. Of course, the right thinks that this turn to culture was a way for um, the Marxists left to destroy American traditions or Western traditions, what have you, rather than what I think of it as, and that is like just another way to think about how we might achieve this zone of freedom that will allow for humans to flourish, or socialism, if you want to call it that. So there were some obvious reasons for this turn to a more cynical Marxism, but I never sort of categorized the cultural Marxists, if you want to call them that, of the 20th century as akin to a sort of like postmodernist nihilism.
Here we go. All right.
Anything else you want to add, Andrew?
No, it's always fun talking to Jim, and it's really good to meet you, David, because I've been talking about the book a lot, but your questions are different, as I expected.
Well,
Yeah, I think we're probably more political than most podcasts. Although I don't know, I have no idea.
It's just kind of more like one of the reasons I've always been a readers of yours, Jim, is because you make me think about things differently, and your questions made me think about things differently. But hopefully I was able to answer your questions
I
with
think this is
some,
great. Yeah,
yeah.
David?
that, these things we're learning, we're not podcast experts. So like to us, it's anything that comes out or gets recorded is great.
Yeah,
Um, it said my internet connection was unstable once or twice.
yeah.
Yeah, you
Did you guys?
glitched a few. It was not enough to ruin what you meant.
Yeah,
Okay, good,
right.
good.
Um, well, I'm still recording, so let me just kill this here. I'll
Okay.
find you. So we could talk about it a little bit.
Okay. I
Yeah,
mean, it would be a good way to conclude too, I think.
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the ways that people get introduced to left thinking these days anyway is from the media, whatever it's independent media or whatever you
Yeah.
want to call it. And I'm not saying that, you need to be a Marxist to go and uh, voice your opinion on left issues, but trashing Karl Marx does not get us anywhere. It would be I'm a theory and practice fetishist, right? I'm going to say that like you have to have some theoretical basis. So when when people have come along over the years and have like recently, it's the term woke nobody likes, right? For whatever reasons, but woke still has to have some kind of ethos behind it, right? It has to have you're not just like if you're woke in the traditional sense, which is that you're a person who really knows what's going on, right? You have an explanation for society and why people get fucked and whatever else. So like what's your framework? What paradigm are you using to use that? And I would say like if you're not a Marxist, you're not woke. But that's not going to fly everywhere, right? So anyway, that was kind of my objection to some of the anti-Marxist talk that I've heard in some of these media sites,
Hmm.
podcast sites.
Yeah, I read an article maybe 2 years ago by Nathan Robinson, who's on the left and he edits current affairs. And I find him quite astute on many things. But in this article, he claimed we on the left we need to ditch Marx, we need to ditch Marxism, totally useless. It's a relic of the past. So I guess he's the sort of like young commentator that's akin to Gareth Stedman Jones or
Hmm.
Jonathan Sperber. Um,
What doesn't
but
I'm sorry, what doesn't he see viable about it?
So he thinks there's too much baggage, and to be talk about equality and freedom, we don't need Marx. To me, and again, he's not anti-intellectual. I find a lot of his writing worthwhile, but to me, that's an anti-intellectual take of the same sort of somebody making the case that, oh, we don't need Gramsci. Like, what? We don't need to read these theorists to understand what's right or wrong. It's like the big Bill Haywood apocryphal quote. I don't need to read Capital. I have the marks of capital on my body. Um, but I think we do need to read Capital, or at least we need to be in conversation with Marx. I don't know. I just keep going back to that. And one of the reasons why we were talking about Chapo Trap House, one of the reasons that I have respect for that podcast is yes, they're comedians, and yes, they come across as cynics. But in an interview I read with them, they called themselves Marxists, and they said like a Marxist can't be a cynic.
Hmm.
And I don't know if they've read Marx. That's not really the point here, because I write about in the book lots of people who were Marxists, who had a Marxist interpretation of the world, who or were in some fashion mobilized by Marx without necessarily reading Marx, because they were in conversation with other people who had read Marx, or because Marx's ideas were in the ethos. And to me, that's, I guess, the thing I like about Chapo Trap House as a project is they were unwavering in their commitment to a class politics in ways that so many, I think, in the sort of left liberal podcast world are not unwavering in, and oftentimes it was more opportunistic. And even though I'm sure they've made quite a nice living from their podcast, kudos to them. I don't see them as opportunistic, and they've been consistent in their politics, whereas lots of people have shifted gears. And they also, even through their cynicism, seem very intellectually curious. And this is not a interview for me to get on their podcast, although I'd happily go on.
You should. Yeah. I like them, and I find that one guy, Felix, I think his name is hysterically funny. I mean, he's very good.
Yeah.
And they also do something which I need, which is that they talk about people and tweets and stuff that I would have never known about,
Mm.
and they're kind of more modern, or contemporary than I am. And it helps me because I have about like 3 minutes worth of Twitter and my head starts to hurt, but they dig up all this, the commentary and so forth. So it's a good, like, kind of synopsis of what's going on in the world, at least online. Um,
Yeah, um they I think are like a nice media representation of millennial socialism, which emerged, I think, around the time of Bernie Sanders' first campaign in 2016, which maybe had a political force that I don't know if it's still there or not, but maybe the New York mayoral race is going to help us determine the future of millennial socialism and the Democratic Party.
I was going to say 60% of voters in New York City, 18 to 34, 60% are for Mamdani.
Yeah,
So it's amazing.
I'm hopeful.
Yeah, me too. I'm
a,
gonna vote tomorrow.
a talented politician, I, I
And
believe.
I've never been uh, so convinced that the Democratic establishment is crumbling as I am right now. And that's a good thing. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
And
yeah,
today I just read that in the Times, Bill Clinton is coming out full for Cuomo, which that ought to help.
yeah. I would say, Christ Almighty. Um, is as long as we're still rolling, how about this? What if it's not opportunistic? Or let's see, wait a minute. What if it is not only opportunistic, but absolutely necessary to finally give up on class or the working class as the constituency or the repository of revolutionary politics? What if we are past the stage in which any one class can conduct a revolution that would satisfy the American people in all their diversity and idiocy, for that matter?
Just pure idiot. We're going to find that kernel and whoever.
Well,
Listen, I agree absolutely with Andrew when he says, look, either we rid ourselves of this kind of exploitation, not necessarily wage labor, but the exploitation that has been drilled into us over now, hundreds of years, or we will never be free. I agree with that absolutely. My question is not whether we need that kind of revolution, however protracted it might be, but who is the agent of that. And I'm firmly with Kenneth Burke on this, and I'm also with Edward Bernstein on this. That is to say, either we invoke the people or we close off most of the constituencies who would be with us on behalf of a non-exploitative, call it what you will, post-capitalist society.
I'm not super attached to like giving a label to the group of people who are going to usher in freedom. Call
Okay.
them the working class, call them the masses, call them the people. I'm just in favor of more and more solidarity across lines that divide a
Yeah.
world.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
All right.
So let me just, all right. So thanks for coming, and I'm going to stop the podcast recording.